Welcome to a discussion of Christian responsibility. I'm Mitch Friedman, and this is episode 2 in our conversation. As a matter of quick review, we opened our conversation with a definition of responsibility when it comes to Christian living. We, as followers of Jesus Christ, having accepted his invitation into his life as he's promised to remake us, we are responsible for living out his commands. The things he says we must do, we do. The things that he says we must not do, we refrain from doing. That's what it means to live under the authority of our great King. And so last time we talked about our goals for this conversation. Goal number 1 is to get more familiar with the King's commands. If I am going to live out his commands, I must know what they are. And as we discussed, this book right here, God's Grand Story, especially in the 4 stories of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contain the majority of everything the King wants us to do. There are a few other places where we see Jesus speaking in the New Testament, but the 4 stories we call the Gospels, the stories of good news, are the places where we find the King's commands. So goal number 1 is to get more familiar with the King's commands. Goal number 2 is to gain more dependence on the King's gift of himself to us. That is who we call the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, the one that is just like Jesus, the another of the same kind that he's given us now as we accepted his invitation into his life to give us the power to live out the King's commands and fulfill our Christian responsibility. So our 2 goals: get more familiar with the King's commands, gain more dependence on the King's power to fulfill our Christian responsibilities. And we ended last time with a statement of actual accountability and a question from the King himself in Luke chapter 6, verse 46, and what we call the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus gives a very clear charge in the form of a question. And he asks us to look in the mirror about our responsibility and our understanding of his commands. He says this: "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" So the implication is, if I don't do what the King says, then I have no business calling him Lord, Lord. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? And what I want to do in this episode is I want to talk about the foundation of fulfilling our Christian responsibility and understanding the King's commands and depending on his power. We're going to look into a text that's found right after that question in Luke 6:46 that is a corollary to other statements of who Jesus is and our goals for following him well when it comes to living out our King's commands. Now, Jesus is not a typical kind of king. Throughout history, every king that we see throughout the history of monarchies and civilizations that were ruled by kings, we see that the king was an absolute power from the top down. But Jesus says he is a different kind of a king. He is one who rules not as a dominant monarch, but as a servant king. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, we see that Jesus' followers are confused about his kingship, and since they are his disciples, they are his closest ones, they want to gain some of this power from the top down. And Jesus said, you just don't get it. It's the kings of this world who dominate from the top down. But if you're going to be part of my kingdom, you are going to now be someone who lives as a servant from the bottom up. Jesus said, whoever wants to be great must be the servant of all. Whoever wants to be first must be the one who is the last. Just as I, Jesus said, not came to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. So we get a picture of Jesus's reign and rule as a servant king in order that we can understand better what our Christian responsibility is as subjects of Jesus's reign and rule. And what I want to do here is I want to talk about the benefits of living according to the king's commands, because a servant king lives for the benefit of others. And Jesus said, if we are to live with him well, serve him well, and serve those around us well, we are going to have to live in the same way. And we will be the beneficiaries of keeping his commands. So in this same text that we find the Sermon on the Plain, and we find Jesus' question of calling him Lord, Lord, and not doing what he says, Jesus follows with a very clear distinction about our foundations for living well. And he says this in Luke chapter 6, I'm going to read here, verse 17 starts the Sermon on the Plain. It says, he went down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, Jerusalem, and from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon. They had all come down. So there's thousands of people, much like the Sermon on the Mount. But then we see that he turns to his disciples and he continues his teaching. And so he's speaking to those who have committed themselves to his rulership at this time. And so as we get to verse 46, he's already talked about what it means. There are a lot of the king's commands here and the king's description of what it means to live well. And in verse 46, again, the question we're all familiar with, and then he continues to the end of the chapter in expanding on the question. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show them what they are like. So this is a description of those who do what the king says. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. So Jesus is saying symbolically that he is the rock and the foundation of beneficial living. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built. Now let's pause right here. What Jesus is not saying is that everyone who builds their house, the actual totality of their lives on him, the foundation, he's not saying that we will be free from all the circumstances and difficulties of life, because he says the flood came and the torrent struck. And we all know that to have a picture of Christian living that assumes that we are going to be spared from the circumstances of life in a fallen place is really a fantasy. And I've known a lot of believers in my time as a pastor and just as a friend of other Christians who get very disillusioned with their Christian walk and with the King himself because the circumstances of life continue to assail them. And I would offer that the more solidly built your house is on the rock of Jesus Christ, the less disillusioned you are, because you know that he is going to provide everything you need here and in the vivid promise of the kingdom to come. So when a flood came, the torrent struck that house that was built on the foundation, the rock. Because it was well built, it did not shake. It did not quiver. It did not fall. And now verse 49. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice. And this is the why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. In the original language, Jesus literally is saying it fell with a great fall. It's an accelerated understanding of the destruction that happens when we hear his words and we don't put them into practice because our foundation is not secure and our house is not well built. The destruction has a great destruction. And so right here in this text, we see the confidence we can gain when we make a commitment to appropriate the King's power, the gift of himself to us, to live out his commands and build on the rock of his very resurrection and the promises therein. We build our entire lives and we avoid the distraction of moving off the foundation and listening to the voices of culture that promise more and more, I would call, flourishing opportunities that aren't dependent on the King and his power. When we stay centered on the foundation, Jesus says, the circumstances of life will not shake us. The house will not fall. But again, the key is to know his words. The one who hears my words and puts them into practice is like the one who dug down deep onto the rock and built their house on the foundation. A corollary text we find in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the first letter in chapter 3, verses 10 through 15. And I'm gonna give you this in your study guide for you to go through together as a group, or if you're enjoying and engaging this series on your own, I can provide you the study guide as well. But 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10 through 15, Paul uses this same sort of metaphor that's analogous to Jesus' conversation here in Luke chapter 6. And he says, no one can lay a foundation other than the one already laid, and that is on Christ Jesus himself. And then I'm not going to say any more about it right now because I want you to get into it yourself. Paul talks about the use of building materials and the outcomes in building well on the foundation that is Jesus Christ. And so as we close our second episode, session number 2 of Christian Responsibility, I really want you to consider this question. Do you know enough about the King's commands to know that you have a solid foundation built on him and his commands so that no circumstance in life is going to shake your house to the core into destruction? And again, sadly, more believers than I would care to count have tragically really abandoned the faith because of a worldview regarding their Christian living that doesn't contain the reality of the solid ground and foundation of life with Jesus that will allow us to overcome the circumstances of life. Because storms are everywhere. They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. They come with health challenges. They come with relationship challenges. They come with the challenges internally that causes me emotional doubt. And the less firm my foundation, the more likely that I am going to experience a great fall. So are you continually making yourself aware of and appropriating and applying the King's commands so that when the storms come, your house will stand firm and you will be more and more confident in the King's leadership of your life? For Christian Responsibility, I'm Mitch Friedman.